The coffee mug slipped from my trembling fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor of our Cedar Heights kitchen. Through the crack in Marcus's home office door, his voice carried with crystal clarity as he spoke into his phone. "Don't worry about Vera finding out about the account transfers. I told her I got fired today, so she'll be too panicked about money to ask questions about where our savings actually went. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." My breath caught in my throat. I had called him 20 minutes earlier, voice shaking with fake tears, telling him Nexus Digital had laid me off. It was supposed to be a test, a way to see if my husband of 8 years would comfort me or lecture me about our finances. I never expected to discover he was using my fabricated crisis as cover for his own deception. The Cayman account should be fully funded by Friday. Marcus continued, his tone casual as if discussing weekend plans. Vera's always been too trusting to question the statements I show her. By the time she realizes what's happening, the money will be safely offshore and I'll be in Singapore with Rebecca. Rebecca? The name hit me like ice water. I pressed my back against the hallway wall, my heart hammering against my ribs as pieces of a puzzle I didn't know existed suddenly clicked into place. The late nights he claimed were client dinners. The business trips that seemed to multiply each month. The way he'd grown distant, irritated by my presence in ways that felt personal rather than professional. "Love you too, baby," he murmured into the phone, and the tenderness in his voice was something I hadn't heard directed at me in months. "Just a few more days and we'll be free of this whole charade." The sound of his chair creaking snapped me back to the moment. I tiptoed quickly to our bedroom, closing the door silently behind me before collapsing onto the edge of our king-sized bed. The room suddenly felt foreign, filled with furniture and photographs that belonged to a life I apparently didn't actually know. 8 years of marriage, 3 years of dating before that, and I was discovering my husband was not just cheating but systematically stealing our joint savings to fund his escape with another woman. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "So sorry about the job hunt. We'll figure this out together. I love you." The hypocrisy made my stomach lurch. Here he was, pretending to console me about a fictional job loss while actively planning to abandon me penniless and alone. I stared at my reflection in the dresser mirror, taking in my rumpled Nexus Digital polo shirt and the stress lines that had appeared around my eyes over the past year. When had I become this version of myself? The woman who accepted Marcus's increasingly cold treatment as normal, who stopped questioning why our savings account statements never quite matched what I expected, who convinced herself that her husband's growing emotional distance was just the natural progression of a long marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had fabricated getting fired to test whether Marcus still cared about my well-being, only to discover he cared so little he was actively working to destroy it. My fake crisis had revealed a real one far worse than anything I could have imagined. I pulled out my laptop, fingers shaking as I logged into our joint bank accounts. For the first time in months, I bypassed the summary statements Marcus always showed me and dug into the actual transaction history. What I found made my blood run cold. Systematic transfers, each just small enough to avoid triggering automatic alerts, had been moving money from our savings into accounts I didn't recognize. The emergency fund we'd built together over years of careful budgeting was nearly gone. My throat tightened as I realized the scope of his betrayal. This wasn't an impulsive affair or a moment of weakness. This was calculated theft from someone who had trusted him completely. The man I'd built a life with, supported through his MBA program, celebrated with at every career milestone, had been methodically planning to leave me financially ruined. A wave of nausea crashed over me as I remembered the conversation we'd had just last week about refinancing our mortgage to access more equity. Marcus had been enthusiastic about the idea, insisting we could use the money for home improvements. Now I understood his real motivation. He'd wanted access to more funds to steal before his final disappearance. The bedroom door opened and Marcus appeared, his expression carefully arranged into concerned husband mode. "Hey, sweetheart. I'm so sorry about today. I know how much that job meant to you." He sat beside me on the bed, placing what should have been a comforting hand on my shoulder. Instead, his touch felt like ice against my skin. "Thank you." I managed, my voice barely steady. I'm just trying to process everything. Of course, he said, his tone perfectly sympathetic. These things happen in the tech industry. We'll tighten our belts for a while, but we'll be fine. I've been thinking we should probably cancel that trip to Asheville. You wanted to take next month. We need to be more careful with spending now. The casual cruelty of his suggestion hit me hard. He was already restricting my movements, limiting my options, while knowing full well that he'd be gone within days. The trip to Asheville had been something I'd been looking forward to for months. A chance to visit the mountain town's famous arts district and take a pottery class I'd been dreaming about since college. You're probably right, I said, hating how small my voice sounded. We should be practical. Marcus squeezed my shoulder before standing. Exactly. I knew you'd understand. That's why I married you, Vera. You're always so reasonable about these things. He kissed the top of my head in a gesture that once would have felt loving but now felt like mockery. I have some calls to make for work. Why don't you order us some dinner? Nothing too expensive. After he left, I sat in the silence of our bedroom, processing the magnitude of what I'd discovered. The man I'd pledged my life to was stealing from me while pretending to love me. He was planning to abandon me while positioning himself as my supportive partner through a crisis he believed was real. The depth of his deception was breathtaking in its completeness. I thought about calling my sister Elena in Seattle, but shame held me back. How could I explain that I'd been so blind to what was happening in my own marriage? That I'd been living with a stranger who'd become expert at wearing my husband's face while planning my destruction. Instead, I found myself opening my laptop again, this time researching divorce lawyers in Portland. The irony struck me that Marcus had unknowingly given me the perfect cover story. If anyone asked why I was suddenly making major life changes, I could cite my fictional job loss as the catalyst. He'd handed me the excuse I needed to start over without revealing I'd discovered his betrayal. As I scrolled through attorney profiles, a different kind of clarity began to emerge from the chaos. For months, I'd been feeling increasingly disconnected from my life, sensing something was wrong but unable to identify what. I'd attributed my unease to work stress, or the natural settling that comes with long-term relationships. Now I understood that my instincts had been trying to warn me about a danger I'd been too trusting to see. The woman staring back at me from the laptop screen wasn't the confident UX designer who'd graduated from Portland State with honors and landed her dream job at a cutting-edge tech company. She wasn't the creative soul who'd once spent entire weekends lost in art projects and hiking trails. Somewhere along the way, I'd allowed myself to become smaller, more cautious, more focused on maintaining peace in my marriage than pursuing my own growth and happiness. Marcus's betrayal was devastating, but it was also illuminating. I'd been living a life built on lies, making decisions based on false information, trusting someone who viewed me not as a partner but as an obstacle to overcome. The pain was sharp and immediate, but underneath it, I detected something unexpected: relief. The vague sense of wrongness that had been haunting me finally had a name, and I closed the laptop and walked to our walk-in closet, studying the clothes hanging there as if seeing them for the first time. Professional blazers in neutral colors, carefully coordinated outfits designed to project competence and respectability. When had I stopped buying clothes that made me feel joy? When had my wardrobe become a uniform designed to blend in rather than stand out? My fingers found the small cedar box tucked behind my winter coats, the one containing jewelry I'd inherited from my grandmother. Inside, beneath the pearls and vintage brooches, was something I'd almost forgotten: a small ceramic pendant I'd made in a college art class. The glaze was imperfect, the shape slightly asymmetrical, but I'd loved it fiercely when I created it. I'd stopped wearing it years ago when Marcus mentioned it looked unprofessional with my work clothes. I fastened the pendant around my neck, the familiar weight of it against my collarbone triggering a flood of memory. Late nights in the studio, my hands covered in clay, completely absorbed in the process of creation. The satisfaction of pulling a finished piece from the kiln, seeing how fire had transformed my work into something permanent and beautiful. The dreams I'd had of eventually opening my own studio, teaching others to find the same peace I'd discovered in shaping clay. Those dreams had faded gradually, pushed aside by the demands of building a career and maintaining a marriage. Marcus had been subtly dismissive of my artistic interests, calling them hobbies rather than passions, encouraging me to focus on more practical pursuits. I'd told myself he was being practical, that he wanted me to succeed professionally. Now I wondered if he'd simply wanted me to be financially dependent and emotionally isolated, easier to control and ultimately easier to abandon. The sound of Marcus ordering dinner in the kitchen drifted down the hallway, his voice animated as he spoke to someone on the phone. Probably Rebecca, I realized, making plans for their new life together while pretending to care about managing our household budget in light of my supposed job loss. The audacity of his performance was almost impressive in its thoroughness. I moved to the window, overlooking our backyard, where Marcus had installed a hot tub the previous summer. He'd justified the expense by talking about how we'd use it for entertaining and relaxation, but looking at it now I realized we'd barely used it together. Most evenings, Marcus was either working late or traveling, and I'd grown accustomed to spending my free time alone, convincing myself that independence was healthy in a marriage. The truth was that I'd been alone for much longer than I'd admitted to myself. Marcus had been physically present but emotionally absent, going through the motions of partnership while secretly planning his exit strategy. Our conversations had become surface-level exchanges about schedules and logistics, rather than the deep sharing of dreams and fears that had characterized our early relationship. When had we stopped talking about the future we wanted to build together? When had our plans shifted from we to I without me noticing? The signs had been there, but I'd been too invested in the story I'd told myself about our marriage to see them clearly. I'd interpreted his growing distance as maturity rather than disengagement, his criticism as concern rather than contempt. My phone buzzed with another text from Marcus. Ordered Thai food. Should be here in 30 minutes. Love you. The casual intimacy of the message, sent while he was actively betraying me, made me feel physically sick. How many times had he texted sweet nothings while simultaneously planning my destruction? How many I love yous had been lies designed to keep me compliant and unsuspecting? I found myself thinking about Dimitri Kostas, the visiting artist who'd taught my college ceramics class. He'd been in his 60s then, a Greek potter with hands permanently stained by clay and eyes that sparkled with genuine enthusiasm for his craft. He'd taught us that pottery was as much about embracing imperfection as achieving technical skill, that the most beautiful pieces often came from unexpected breaks in the glaze, or slight asymmetries in the form. The clay teaches you to let go, he'd said during one memorable late-night studio session. You can plan and control only so much. The rest you must trust to the fire and the chemistry and the mystery of transformation. At the time I'd thought he was being poetic about art. Now I wondered if he'd been talking about life itself. My marriage to Marcus had been my attempt to control every variable, to build something perfect and permanent through careful planning and unwavering commitment. But I'd been working with flawed materials, trying to create beauty with someone who was fundamentally dishonest about his intentions. The sound of gravel crunching in our driveway announced the arrival of our dinner. I listened to Marcus's cheerful interaction with the delivery driver, his voice warm and friendly in the way that had first attracted me to him at a mutual friend's party 11 years ago. He'd been charming then, attentive and interested in my thoughts and dreams. When had that genuine interest transformed into manipulation? Had it ever been real? Or had I simply been naive about his capacity for deception? Dinner's here, Marcus called from the kitchen, his tone carefully upbeat. I got your favorite pad thai. Figured you could use some comfort food after today. I joined him at our granite breakfast bar, accepting the takeout container he offered with hands that felt disconnected from my body. The familiar ritual of sharing a meal felt surreal now that I knew about his plans to abandon me. Every gesture of normalcy was revealed as performance, every moment of apparent intimacy as manipulation. You know, Marcus said between bites of his curry, maybe this job loss is actually an opportunity. You've been stressed about work for months. Maybe this is the universe telling you to take a break, reassess what you really want. The irony of his words was staggering. He was right that I'd been stressed, but not because of work pressure. I'd been responding to the subconscious knowledge that something fundamental was wrong in my life, the creeping awareness that the person closest to me was becoming a stranger. My stress hadn't been about deadlines or difficult clients. It had been about living with someone who was systematically deceiving me. Maybe you're right, I said carefully. Maybe I should think about what I really want. Marcus smiled, the expression not quite reaching his eye. That's my girl, always looking for the silver lining. He reached across the counter to squeeze my hand and I had to force myself not to pull away. We'll figure this out together, we always do. The lie was so complete, so confidently delivered, that I almost doubted my own knowledge of his betrayal. But the evidence was undeniable: the bank transfers, the conversation about the Cayman account, the mention of Rebecca and Singapore. Marcus was a skilled actor, but he wasn't skilled enough to erase what I'd overheard. After dinner, Marcus retreated to his office for what he claimed were important calls with West Coast clients. I used the time to conduct more research, both about the extent of his financial deception and about my options for responding to it. What I discovered about our joint assets was worse than I'd initially realized. Marcus had been systematically moving money for months, not just from our savings, but from my individual retirement account and the investment portfolio we'd built together. The scope of his theft was breathtaking. He hadn't just been unfaithful, he'd been conducting a long-term financial assault designed to leave me as vulnerable as possible when he finally disappeared. Every account I checked revealed the same pattern: regular transfers to unfamiliar institutions, money flowing away from our shared future toward his private escape plan. But I also discovered something else in my research. Marcus had made mistakes. In his confidence that I would never question his financial management, he'd left traces of his deception that could be uncovered by someone who knew where to look. Email confirmations for international wire transfers, account statements for investments I'd never heard of, a paper trail that would be invaluable if I decided to pursue legal action. As I compiled screenshots and printed documents, I felt a strange sense of empowerment beginning to emerge from the devastation. Marcus had underestimated me, assumed that my trust in him was synonymous with ignorance about our finances. He'd been wrong. I might have been naive about his character, but I wasn't stupid about money or incapable of learning what I needed to know. The ceramic pendant around my neck caught the light from my laptop screen, reminding me of who I'd been before I'd allowed my world to shrink around Marcus's expectations and limitations. That woman had been creative, independent, willing to take risks in pursuit of her passion. She'd traveled alone, made art that reflected her inner vision, dreamed about possibilities rather than settling for security. Somewhere in the process of becoming Marcus's wife, I'd lost touch with that version of myself. I'd accepted his subtle criticisms and gentle redirections, allowing him to shape me into someone more convenient for his purposes. But that transformation hadn't been irreversible. The woman I'd been was still there, waiting beneath the surface, ready to reclaim her life and her power. The grandfather clock in our living room chimed 11 times, and I realized I'd been researching for hours, while Marcus remained closeted in his office. His dedication to his work calls was probably less about West Coast time zones and more about coordinating his exit strategy with Rebecca. The thought should have hurt more than it did, but I found myself feeling oddly detached from the emotional devastation I'd expected. Instead, I felt clear-headed in a way I hadn't experienced in months. The uncertainty that had been plaguing me was gone, replaced by the sharp focus that comes with finally understanding the true nature of a problem. Marcus wasn't the man I'd married, and our marriage wasn't the partnership I'd believed it to be. Those realizations were painful, but they were also liberating. I thought again about the trip to Asheville I'd been planning, the pottery workshop I'd been excited to attend. Marcus had been quick to suggest canceling it, ostensibly to save money in light of my fictional job loss. But I suspected his real motivation was to keep me close, while he finalized his preparations to leave. He needed me present and unsuspecting for his plan to work perfectly. What if I didn't cooperate with his timeline? What if, instead of staying home and playing the role of the devastated, unemployed wife, I took the trip anyway? Marcus would object, but he couldn't prevent me from leaving without revealing that his concern wasn't really about money. And if I was going to start over, if I was going to reclaim the life he'd stolen from me, perhaps beginning that process in a place dedicated to art and creativity was exactly what I needed. The idea took root with surprising strength. As evil represented everything I'd set aside to build a life with Marcus, creativity, independence, the courage to pursue unconventional paths. If I was going to discover who I was without him, if I was going to rebuild from the devastation of his betrayal, I needed to return to the source of my own power and vision. Marcus's office door opened, and I quickly closed my laptop, feigning sleep when he entered our bedroom. I listened to him moving through his nighttime routine, brushing his teeth and changing into pajamas with the same casual efficiency he'd maintained throughout his months of deception. When he slipped into bed beside me, I kept my breathing steady and deep, afraid that any conversation might reveal what I'd learned. But as he settled into sleep, I lay awake, planning. Tomorrow I would begin the process of extricating myself from the life Marcus had been systematically destroying. I would take the trip to Asheville, not as an escape from my problems but as the first step toward solutions I couldn't yet imagine. I would return to the clay and the fire and the mystery of transformation that Dimitri Costas had taught me to embrace. Marcus had tried to test my dependence by stealing my security and planning my abandonment. Instead, he'd accidentally given me the greatest gift possible, the knowledge that I needed to save myself, and the motivation to do whatever that required. His betrayal had shattered my illusions about our marriage, but it had also revealed the strength I'd forgotten I possessed. The woman who'd discovered his deception wasn't the same woman who'd fabricated a job loss to test his love. She was someone harder, clearer, more honest about the realities of her situation. She was someone who remembered what it felt like to shape something beautiful from raw materials, to trust in the process of transformation, even when the outcome remained uncertain. As sleep finally claimed me, I clutched the ceramic pendant at my throat, already feeling the clay calling me back to myself. The morning light filtering through our bedroom curtains felt different somehow, as if the world itself had shifted overnight. I woke before my alarm, my body humming with an energy I hadn't felt in years. Marcus still slept beside me, his breathing deep and regular, completely unaware that his carefully constructed deception had crumbled while he dreamed. I slipped out of bed quietly, padding to the kitchen where I made coffee with unusual deliberation. Each movement felt intentional, weighted with purpose. Today would be the day I stopped being the woman Marcus thought he could manipulate and started becoming someone he'd never anticipated. My laptop sat on the kitchen counter where I'd left it, and I opened it to find the Asheville workshop registration page still displayed on the screen. The course was called Finding Your Voice in Clay, and ran for 2 weeks at a studio called Mountain Heart Ceramic. The instructor was listed as Anya Volkov, a Russian-born potter whose work I'd admired online for months. The timing was perfect, starting the following Monday, just 4 days away. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Without allowing myself to second-guess the decision, I clicked the registration button and entered my credit card information. The transaction went through instantly, and I felt a surge of satisfaction at using my own money, from my own account, to fund my own plans. Marcus had been so focused on draining our joint accounts that he'd overlooked my personal checking account, funded by freelance design work I'd done on weekends. The confirmation email arrived within minutes, along with detailed instructions about the studio location and recommended accommodations in downtown Asheville. I found myself smiling as I read through the materials list, remembering the tactile pleasure of working with clay, the meditative rhythm of centering and shaping that had once brought me such peace. Marcus appeared in the kitchen 20 minutes later, already dressed for work in his standard uniform of crisp dress shirt and expensive tie. His hair was perfectly styled, his cologne subtle but noticeable, everything about his appearance calculated to project success and reliability. Looking at him now, knowing what I knew, I marveled at how thoroughly he'd fooled me for so long. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said, kissing my cheek with practiced affection. "How are you feeling today? Any thoughts about what you want to do next, job-wise?" "Actually, yes," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I've decided to take that trip to Asheville after all. I think you were right that this might be an opportunity to reassess what I want." Marcus's coffee mug paused halfway to his lips, and I caught a flicker of something sharp in his expression before he recovered his composure. "Asheville? But we talked about this yesterday. With money being tight, we should probably postpone any unnecessary travel." "It's not unnecessary," I replied, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. "I've already registered for a pottery workshop. It's something I need to do for myself right now." "Pottery?" Marcus's tone carried a note of condescension I'd somehow trained myself not to hear before. "Vera, be realistic. This isn't the time for expensive hobbies. You need to focus on finding another job, networking with contacts in the tech industry. Playing with clay isn't going to pay our mortgage." The dismissiveness in his voice crystallized something inside me. This was how he'd always spoken about my creative interests, reducing them to frivolous indulgences that interfered with more practical concerns. I'd accepted his perspective for so long that I'd almost forgotten how passionate I'd once been about making art, how alive it had made me feel. "I'm going," I said quietly. "I leave Monday morning." Marcus set down his coffee mug with enough force to create a small splash. "This is exactly the kind of impractical thinking that got you fired in the first place." The accusation hung between us, and I realized this was the moment of truth. Marcus was revealing his true feelings about what he believed had happened to me, showing me exactly how little support I could expect from him even in a crisis he thought was real. The man who claimed to love me was using my supposed professional failure as ammunition to control my choices. "I didn't get fired for impractical thinking," I said, maintaining eye contact. "And I'm not asking your permission to go to Asheville. I'm informing you that I'm going." Something cold flickered across Marcus's features, a glimpse of the calculating personality he usually kept hidden beneath his charming facade. "Fine," he said after a long pause. "Waste money we don't have on a pointless trip. But don't expect me to clean up the mess when you get back and realize we're behind on bills." He grabbed his briefcase and headed for the garage without his usual goodbye kiss, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the echo of his barely contained anger. I understood now that his objection to my trip had nothing to do with finances and everything to do with control. He needed me to stay put, predictable and manageable, while he finalized his plans to disappear with Rebecca and our stolen savings. But I wasn't going to be manageable anymore. I was going to Asheville, and I was going to remember who I'd been before I'd allowed Marcus to convince me that my dreams were impractical distractions from more important realities. The next 3 days passed in a blur of careful preparation. I booked a room at a bed and breakfast called the Artisan's Haven, located within walking distance of the Mountain Heart Ceramics studio. I researched restaurants and galleries in the area, mapping out an itinerary that would immerse me completely in Asheville's creative community. Most importantly, I quietly transferred additional funds from my freelance account into a separate checking account Marcus didn't know about. I told him I was staying for 1 week, the minimum duration that would seem reasonable for a pottery workshop. In reality, I'd left my schedule open-ended, unsure how long I would need to figure out my next steps. The beauty of having supposedly lost my job was that I had no immediate professional obligations to return to. Marcus had unknowingly given me the perfect cover for an extended absence. Marcus's behavior during those 3 days was telling. He alternated between cold disapproval and exaggerated concern, as if he couldn't decide whether to punish me for defying him or maintain his facade of supportive husband. I caught him on several phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room, and he spent increasing amounts of time in his office with the door closed. On Friday evening, he made an unexpected announcement over dinner. "I just found out I need to fly to Singapore next week for a client emergency. I'll probably be gone for 10 days. Maybe 2 weeks." The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Marcus was using my absence to accelerate his own plans, probably to finalize whatever arrangements he needed to make before his permanent departure. The knowledge should have devastated me, but instead I felt a strange sense of relief. We would both be gone from Portland at the same time, pursuing our separate agendas, and I wouldn't have to maintain the pretense of normalcy while knowing what I knew about his intentions. "That's too bad," I said, matching his casual tone. "But I guess the timing works out, with me being away too." "Yeah," Marcus agreed, not quite meeting my eyes. "Sometimes these things just work out." Sunday evening, I packed my suitcase with a mixture of practical clothes and items I hadn't worn in years. I included the ceramic pendant that had reminded me of my artistic past, along with a few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother. I had no specific plan for these items, but something told me they might be important in whatever came next. I also packed a manila folder containing printed copies of all the financial documents I'd discovered. Evidence of Marcus's systematic theft of our assets. I wasn't sure yet how I would use this information, but I wanted it with me, safely away from our house and Marcus's potential interference. Marcus was unusually attentive that evening, bringing me tea and asking detailed questions about my workshop schedule and the bed and breakfast where I'd be staying. I realized he was gathering information he could use to locate me if necessary, though I doubted he actually intended to contact me during what he expected to be his final week in Portland. "I'll miss you," he said as we got ready for bed, the words delivered with a performance of sincerity that would have convinced me completely just a week earlier. "I'll miss you too," I replied, and was surprised to discover that part of me actually meant not the Marcus who was betraying me, but the man I'd thought I'd married, the person I'd built my life around for 8 years. That version of Marcus had never actually existed, but grieving his loss felt necessary anyway. Monday morning arrived crisp and clear, with the kind of mountain light that promised good weather for traveling. Marcus had already left for his own trip, claiming an early flight that required him to leave before dawn. I suspected he was actually eager to avoid prolonged goodbyes that might require additional deception. I loaded my suitcase into my Honda Civic and took one last look at our house in Cedar Heights. The perfectly manicured lawn and designer exterior had once represented everything I'd thought I wanted: stability, success, social respectability. Now it looked like a movie set, beautiful but artificial, lacking any connection to genuine emotion or authentic experience. The drive to Asheville took 6 hours through some of the most beautiful landscape in the Pacific Northwest and Northern California. I stopped frequently, not because I needed gas or food, but because I wanted to absorb the experience of traveling alone, making decisions based purely on my own interests and timing. When had I last taken a trip without consulting Marcus about every detail, without adjusting my preferences to accommodate his schedule and priorities? As the miles accumulated behind me, I felt layers of tension I hadn't realized I was carrying begin to dissolve. My shoulders relaxed, my breathing deepened, and a kind of alertness I'd forgotten I possessed began to emerge. The world outside my car windows seemed more vivid, more present, as if I'd been viewing life through a filter that had finally been removed. I reached Asheville in the late afternoon, driving slowly through the downtown area to get my bearings. The city was smaller than Portland, but more eclectic, with a mixture of historic architecture and modern artistic installations that spoke to a community comfortable with both tradition and innovation. Street musicians performed on corners, galleries displayed local artwork in their windows, and people moved with the unhurried pace of those who'd chosen lifestyle over pure ambition. The Artisan's Haven bed and breakfast was exactly what I'd hoped for: a converted Victorian house with original hardwood floors, handmade quilts and artwork from local artists covering every wall. The owner, Carlotta Moreau, greeted me with genuine warmth and immediately began sharing recommendations for restaurants and cultural events happening during my stay. "First time in Asheville?" she asked as she showed me to my room on the second floor. "Yes," I said, then found myself adding, "I'm here for a pottery workshop at Mountain Heart Ceramics." Carlotta's face lit up. "Oh, you'll love Anya Volkov. She's an incredible teacher and an even better human being. Are you an experienced potter?" "I used to be," I said, realizing as I spoke that this was the most honest answer I could give. "I'm hoping to remember what I loved about it." "Perfect," Carlotta said, settling me into a room with tall windows overlooking a garden where other guests sat reading and sketching. "Anya specializes in helping people rediscover their creative voices. You're in exactly the right place." That evening, I walked through downtown Asheville with no agenda beyond exploring and getting comfortable with my new surroundings. I ate dinner alone at a farm-to-table restaurant called The Local Table, savoring both the perfectly prepared food and the novel experience of dining without having to consider anyone else's preferences or schedule. After dinner, I wandered through the River Arts District, where dozens of studios and galleries occupied converted industrial buildings along the French Broad River. Artists worked with their doors open, inviting passers-by to observe their processes and ask questions about their technique. The atmosphere was collaborative rather than competitive, creative rather than commercial, everything I'd missed about being part of an artistic community. I found myself standing outside Mountain Heart Ceramics, peering through the large windows at the studio where I would begin my workshop the next morning. Pottery wheels stood in neat rows, and shelves displayed finished pieces in various stages of the firing process. The space felt alive even though it was empty, charged with the potential energy of creation and transformation. A woman appeared at the window, waving when she noticed me looking in. She opened the door and stepped outside, extending her hand in greeting. "You must be one of my new students. I'm Anya Volkov." She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, and clothes that showed evidence of recent work with clay. Her handshake was firm, her eye contact direct, and something about her presence immediately put me at ease. "Vera Castellanos," I said. "I'm registered for the workshop starting tomorrow." "Wonderful," Anya said, her slight Russian accent adding music to her words. "Tell me, what brings you to ceramics? Are you returning to something you once loved, or exploring something completely new?" The question was more perceptive than I'd expected from a casual introduction. "Returning," I said. "I studied pottery in college, but haven't touched clay in probably 8 years. I'm hoping it's like riding a bicycle." Anya smiled. "In some ways it is, but in the most important ways it isn't. The clay doesn't care what you used to know. It only responds to who you are right now, in this moment. Tomorrow we'll discover who that person is." Her words stayed with me as I walked back to the bed and breakfast, carrying a promise of discovery that felt both exciting and terrifying. Who was I right now, stripped of the roles and expectations that had defined me for so long? What would I create when I was accountable only to my own vision and intentions? That night I lay in the comfortable bed surrounded by the sounds of an unfamiliar city, feeling more hopeful than I had in months. Marcus was probably on a plane to Singapore at that very moment, believing he'd successfully manipulated me into staying safely in Portland, while he finalized his escape plans. Instead, I was embarking on my own journey of escape and discovery, one that would lead me back to the person I'd been before I'd allowed fear and convention to shape my choices. The ceramic pendant rested against my collarbone, a tangible reminder of the creative passion that had once defined me. Tomorrow I would return to the clay and the wheel and the mystery of transformation. I would begin the process of rebuilding my life from the ground up, using only materials that were honest and techniques that honored my authentic self. Marcus had tested my dependence and found it lacking. Now it was my turn to test my independence and discover just how strong I could become when I stopped trying to be the person someone else needed me to be and started becoming the person I was meant to be all along. The mountain air drifted through my open window, carrying the scent of possibility and change. Somewhere in the distance I could hear the faint sound of music from the downtown streets, the laughter of people who'd chosen to build their lives around creativity and community rather than status and security. Soon I would find out if I had the courage to join them. The alarm on my phone buzzed softly at 7 in the morning, but I was already awake, having spent the last hour listening to the gentle sounds of Asheville stirring to life outside my window. Birds called from the garden below, and I could hear the distant hum of early commuters beginning their day. The anticipation I felt was different from any nervousness I'd experienced before. It carried excitement rather than dread. I dressed in clothes I'd chosen specifically for working with clay, an old pair of jeans I'd found buried in my closet, and a cotton shirt that had once been my favorite before Marcus convinced me it looked too casual for someone in my position. Looking at myself in the antique mirror above the dresser, I barely recognized the woman staring back. Without the carefully applied makeup and professional styling I'd maintained for years, I looked younger somehow, more authentic. Carlotta had prepared a breakfast of homemade granola, fresh fruit and coffee that tasted like it had been roasted that morning. She sat with me in the sunny dining room, pointing out various local artists' work hanging on the walls and sharing stories about the creative community I was about to join. "Anya has a gift for seeing what people need," Carlotta said, refilling my coffee cup. "Some students come to her wanting to learn technique, others come seeking therapy, and a few come looking for themselves. She meets everyone exactly where they are." "What if someone doesn't know where they are?" I asked, surprising myself with the vulnerability in the question. Carlotta smiled knowingly, That's usually when the most interesting discoveries happen. I walked to Mountain Heart Ceramics, through streets that felt alive with creative energy. Murals covered the sides of buildings. Sculpture installations marked intersections. And even the sidewalks featured embedded mosaics created by local artists. This was a place where making art wasn't considered a luxury or hobby, but an essential part of daily life. The studio was already bustling when I arrived. With 5 other students arranging their materials at workstations around the room, Anya moved between them with fluid grace, offering quiet words of encouragement and technical guidance. The space smelled of earth and possibility, a combination that immediately transported me back to those late nights in my college studio when I'd lost track of time and the rhythm of creation. "Welcome everyone," Anya said as the last student arrived. "Today we begin a journey that is as much about self-discovery as it is about clay. Each of you has come here carrying something. Expectations, fears, hopes, stories about who you think you are and what you believe you can create. Over the next 2 weeks, we're going to set those stories aside and let the clay teach us who we actually are." She led us through a meditation exercise, asking us to close our eyes and feel the weight and texture of the clay in our hands, before attempting to shape. The sensation was electrifying, cool and smooth and infinitely malleable, responsive to the slightest pressure yet possessing its own essential character that couldn't be completely controlled. "Clay remembers everything," Anya explained as we began our first centering exercise. "Every touch, every pressure, every moment of hesitation or confidence. It will show you things about yourself you may not be ready to see. Trust the process, even when it becomes uncomfortable." My first attempts at centering were disastrous. The clay wobbled wildly on the wheel, collapsing into lopsided mounds that bore no resemblance to the graceful forms I remembered creating in college. Frustration built in my chest as I watched other students, some of them complete beginners, achieve better results with what seemed like less effort. "Breathe," Anya said quietly, appearing beside my wheel. "You're fighting the clay instead of partnering with. What are you trying to control that doesn't need to be controlled?" The question hit deeper than technique. I realized I was approaching the clay the same way I'd approached my marriage, with rigid expectations about outcomes, desperate to achieve some predetermined version of perfection rather than allowing the natural process to unfold. I'd been trying to force the clay into submission rather than working with its inherent properties. "I don't know how to not control things," I admitted, my hands stilling on the wheel. "Then perhaps that's what you're here to learn," Anya. "Try again, but this time let the clay lead and you follow." The shift was subtle but profound. Instead of imposing my will on the spinning clay, I began to feel for its natural tendencies, supporting its movement rather than directing it. Slowly, imperfectly, a rough bowl shape began to emerge. It wasn't beautiful or symmetrical, but it was honest, a direct reflection of the tentative partnership I was learning to create between intention and surrender. "Better," Anya nodded approvingly. "This piece has soul. Technique can be taught, but soul must be discovered." The morning flew by in a blur of focused concentration punctuated by moments of revelation. Each time I began to tense up and try to force a result, the clay would collapse or tear, teaching me lessons about patience and trust that extended far beyond pottery. When I relaxed and allowed the process to guide me, surprising possibilities emerged. During lunch break, I found myself in conversation with Tobias Chen, a fellow student who'd driven down from Charlotte for the workshop. He was a software engineer taking a sabbatical to explore creative alternatives to his high-stress career, and something about his story resonated with my own journey away from conventional expectations. "I spent 10 years building someone else's vision of success," he said as we sat in a small cafe near the studio. "Great salary, impressive title, all the markers that were supposed to make me happy. But I was dying inside, going through the motions of a life that felt completely disconnected from who I actually am." "What made you finally make a change?" I asked, genuinely curious about how someone finds the courage to abandon security for uncertainty. "My grandmother passed away last year, and in her final weeks she kept asking me about my dreams, not my achievements." I realized I had no good answer. I'd become so focused on meeting external expectations that I'd lost touch with my own desires and values. His words struck me with uncomfortable accuracy. How long had it been since someone had asked me about my dreams rather than my accomplishments? How long since I'd even asked myself that question? Marcus had gradually trained me to view dreams as impractical distractions from more serious responsibilities. But sitting here in this mountain town surrounded by people who'd built entire lives around pursuing their creative visions, his perspective seemed narrow and limiting rather than wide. The afternoon session focused on glazing techniques, and Anya introduced us to the unpredictable alchemy of ceramic firing. She showed us examples of pieces where the glaze had run in unexpected directions, creating effects that were more beautiful than anything the artist had originally planned. "This is why I love ceramics," she explained, holding up a vase where deep blue glaze had pooled and crystallized in stunning, unrepeatable patterns. "You can plan and prepare and execute with great skill, but ultimately, you must surrender to forces beyond your control. The fire makes the final decisions about what your piece will become." The metaphor was impossible to ignore. I'd spent years trying to create a perfect marriage through careful planning and unwavering commitment. But I'd been working with fundamentally incompatible material. Marcus's dishonesty and my trust couldn't be forced into harmony any more than oil and water could be blended through sheer determination. Sometimes the most beautiful outcomes emerged from accepting what couldn't be controlled rather than exhausting yourself trying to impose impossible order. That evening, I walked through downtown Asheville with Tobias and 2 other workshop participants, exploring galleries and craft shops while sharing stories about the creative paths that had led us to this moment. The conversation flowed easily, unmarked by the competitive undertones that characterized so many of my professional interactions in Portland. These people were interested in growth and discovery rather than status and achievement. We ended up at a small music venue where a local folk duo was performing songs about mountain life and the healing power of community. The lyrics spoke of finding home in unexpected places, of being welcomed by strangers who recognized something essential in you that you'd forgotten about yourself. I felt tears gathering in my eyes as the music articulated emotions I'd been struggling to name. During a break between sets, Tobias turned to me with a directness that would have felt intrusive from someone I'd known longer but seemed natural coming from him. "You seem like someone who's running towards something rather than away from something. That's unusual. Most people I meet are fleeing their old lives rather than building new ones." "Maybe I'm doing both," I said, considering the observation. "Running away from who I became, and toward who I used to be. That's even more unusual," he said with a smile. "Most people want to become someone new. You want to become someone you already were." His insight stayed with me as I walked back to the bed and breakfast alone, choosing a longer route that took me past the river and through neighborhoods where artists had converted old warehouses into studios and galleries. Porch lights illuminated spaces where people worked late into the evening, and I could see painters at easels, sculptors shaping metal, jewelers bent over intricate designs. This was a community that understood the necessity of creative expression, that treated art making as essential rather than optional. Back in my room, I checked my phone for the first time since leaving Portland, and found 3 missed calls from Marcus, along with several text messages expressing concern about my safety and requesting updates about my location and activities. The messages carried an undertone of surveillance that I'd somehow trained myself not to notice before. He wasn't checking in because he missed me. He was monitoring my movements to ensure I remained predictable and manageable. I composed a brief response letting him know I was safe and enjoying the workshop, but I didn't provide the detailed itinerary he was clearly seeking. Something had shifted in me during these first days in Asheville, a growing sense of autonomy that made his attempts at long-distance control feel invasive rather than caring. The second day of the workshop brought new challenges as Anya introduced more advanced techniques that required sustained concentration and physical coordination. My hands, soft from years of computer work, developed blisters that Anya treated with a homemade salve while explaining that calluses were badges of honor rather than inconveniences to be avoided. "Your hands are learning to speak a new language," she said as she bandaged my finger. "Every blister represents a conversation between your body and the clay. Soon they'll understand each other perfectly." The physical demands of pottery were unlike anything I'd experienced in my carefully controlled adult life. My back ached from hunching over the wheel, My arms burned from the sustained effort of centering and shaping, and clay dust worked its way into my hair and under my fingernails, despite my best efforts to stay clean. But there was something deeply satisfying about this honest tiredness, this evidence of meaningful work that produced tangible results. By the end of the week, I had created a small collection of pieces that bore little resemblance to the polished perfection I'd initially aimed for, but possessed something more valuable: authenticity. Each bowl, mug, and vase carried the marks of my learning process, the slight asymmetries and surface variations that proved they'd been made by human hands rather than machines. "These pieces tell your story," Anya said as we arranged my work for the first fire. "They show someone learning to trust process over outcome, relationship over control. That's the most important lesson clay can teach." The weekend brought a different kind of learning as several workshop participants joined local artists for a community event called First Friday, where galleries and studios throughout the River Arts District opened their doors for an evening of art, music, and conversation. I found myself drawn into discussions about creative philosophy, sustainable living, and the courage required to build a life around artistic values in a culture that prioritized economic success above all else. One conversation, with a textile artist named Rosa who'd moved to Asheville from Manhattan 5 years earlier, particularly resonated with my current situation. She described the gradual process of extricating herself from a high-powered fashion career that had left her creatively and spiritually bankrupt. "The hardest part wasn't leaving the job," she explained as we admired her latest series of naturally dyed wall hangings. "The hardest part was admitting that the person I'd become in that world wasn't someone I actually liked or respected. I had to grieve the loss of that identity before I could figure out who I wanted to be instead." Her words articulated something I'd been struggling to understand about my own experience. I wasn't just dealing with Marcus's betrayal, I was confronting the uncomfortable reality that the woman he'd betrayed had allowed herself to become smaller and more compliant than her authentic self would have accepted. Rebuilding my life wasn't just about escaping his control. It was about reclaiming the agency I'd gradually surrendered in the name of marital harmony. The second week of the workshop focused on glazing and firing, processes that required patience and faith in outcomes that couldn't be completely predicted or controlled. Anya taught us about the transformative power of fire, how extreme heat could turn ordinary clay into something permanent and beautiful, but only if the piece had been properly prepared and was strong enough to withstand the stress of the kiln. "Some pieces don't survive their first firing," she explained as we loaded our work into the massive kiln. "They crack or warp or explode and we have to start over. That's not failure, it's information. The clay is telling us something about its readiness for transformation." I thought about my marriage as we sealed the kiln and began the long firing process. Perhaps Marcus's betrayal wasn't the destruction of something strong but the inevitable collapse of something that had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. I'd been trying to fire a piece that wasn't properly prepared, attempting to create permanence from materials that couldn't withstand the heat of honest examination. The waiting period while our pieces fired was both agonizing and liberating. Anya used the time to teach us about the business aspects of pottery, sharing practical information about pricing work, finding markets, and building sustainable creative careers. For the first time in years, I found myself seriously considering how I might restructure my professional life around creative fulfillment rather than just financial security. The hardest part about making art your livelihood isn't the financial uncertainty, Anya explained during one of these sessions. It's maintaining your creative integrity while meeting market demands. You have to find ways to honor your authentic vision while creating work that speaks to others. Her words sparked something in me that had been dormant for years. I began to envision a future where I combined my technical design skills with ceramic artistry, perhaps creating functional pottery for restaurants and hotels, or developing a line of handmade serving pieces that reflected my growing understanding of how beauty could emerge from embracing imperfection. When the kiln cooled enough to open, 3 days later, the anticipation was almost unbearable. One by one, Anya removed our pieces, revealing how the fire had transformed our careful work into something altogether new. Some pieces had indeed cracked or warped beyond recognition, but others had achieved a beauty that exceeded anything we'd imagined possible. My small collection had survived the firing with only minor casualties. The bowl I'd struggled with on that first day had developed a subtle texture where the glaze had pooled and crystallized, creating effects that no amount of planning could have achieved. The imperfections I'd worried about had become the most interesting features, adding character and uniqueness that mass-produced pottery could never possess. "This is what surrender looks like," Anya said, holding up one of my pieces to catch the afternoon light streaming through the studio windows. "You stopped fighting the process and allowed it to teach you something you couldn't have learned any other way." As I packed my finished pottery carefully in bubble wrap for the journey home, I realized that I was carrying more than ceramic pieces back to Portland. I was bringing evidence of my capacity for transformation. Proof that I could create something beautiful and meaningful when I stopped trying to control every variable and started trusting in processes larger than my own will. The night before my departure, Carlotta hosted a small dinner party at the bed and breakfast for workshop participants and local artists. The conversation ranged from technical discussions about firing temperatures to philosophical explorations of what it meant to live an authentic life in a world that often rewarded conformity over creativity. Tobias, who had decided to extend his stay in Asheville for another month, offered a toast that captured something essential about what we'd all experienced. "To the courage to start over," he said, raising his glass of local wine. "To the wisdom to know when something isn't working, and to the faith that something better is always possible." As glasses clinked around the table and conversation resumed, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected community I'd found in this mountain town. These people had welcomed me not because of my professional credentials or social connections, but because I'd shown up authentically, willing to be vulnerable in the service of learning and growth. They'd demonstrated that it was possible to build a life around values rather than expectations, creativity rather than compliance. My phone buzzed with another text from Marcus, this one more insistent in tone. He wanted to know my exact return date and time, claiming he needed to coordinate his own travel schedule. I realized that his trip to Singapore was probably ending soon, and he was growing anxious about maintaining control over the narrative of our separate journey. Instead of responding immediately, I walked out onto the bed and breakfast front porch, where Anya sat in a rocking chair, sketching by the light of the porch lamp. She looked up as I joined her, setting aside her notebook with the unhurried grace that characterized all her movements. "Heavy thoughts?" she asked, nodding toward the phone in my hand. "Complicated thoughts," I corrected. "I'm not the same person who arrived here 2 weeks ago, but I'm not sure what that means for the life I'm returning to." Anya was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "Clay teaches us that transformation is irreversible," she finally said. "Once you've been through the fire, you can't go back to being unfired. Clay, you can be broken and reformed into something new, but you can never again be what you were before." Her words carried the weight of personal experience, and I sensed that she was speaking from her own journey of transformation. "What if the life you built before you changed doesn't fit the person you've become?" I asked. "Then you have a choice," she said simply. "You can try to squeeze yourself back into something that no longer fits, or you can trust that you're strong enough now to build something better." As I prepared for sleep that night, packing the last of my belongings and setting my alarm for an early departure, I knew that I was returning to Portland fundamentally changed. The woman who drove away from Asheville in the morning wouldn't be the same one who'd arrived seeking to remember what she'd loved about pottery. I'd found something much more valuable than creative inspiration. I'd rediscovered the strength and clarity I'd possessed before I'd allowed fear and convention to shape my choices. Marcus would be expecting me to return chastened and dependent, ready to accept whatever limitations he felt were necessary given our supposedly reduced financial circumstances. Instead, he would find someone who'd remembered what it felt like to create something beautiful from raw materials, someone who'd learned to trust in processes of transformation that couldn't be controlled or manipulated. The drive ahead would take me back to the house in Cedar Heights, to the marriage built on deception, to the man who thought he'd successfully managed my responses to his betrayal, but I would be carrying evidence of my own power with me, pottery that proved I could create beauty from chaos, connections with people who valued authenticity over achievement, and most importantly, the knowledge that I was capable of building a life that honored my true self rather than accommodating someone else's limitations. The fire had done its work. I was ready for whatever came next. The familiar skyline of Portland emerged through my windshield as I crested the final hill on I-84, but the city looked different now, smaller somehow, as if my perspective had fundamentally shifted during my time in the mountains. The urban landscape that had once represented sophistication and opportunity now appeared harsh and artificial, all steel and glass where Asheville had been stone and wood, all hurried efficiency where the mountain town had embraced contemplative rhythm. I pulled into our driveway in Cedar Heights just as the afternoon shadows were lengthening across our manicured lawn. The house stood exactly as I'd left it 2 weeks earlier, but I felt like an anthropologist returning to study a culture I'd once inhabited, but no longer fully understood. The perfect exterior, the carefully tended landscaping, the expensive cars in neighboring driveways, all of it seemed designed to project an image rather than shelter authentic life. Marcus's BMW was already in the garage, which meant he'd returned from his supposed business trip ahead of schedule. I sat in my car for several minutes, gathering myself for the performance I would need to deliver. He would be expecting me to return subdued and dependent, grateful for his guidance through our financial difficulties, ready to abandon any impractical dreams in favor of practical solutions he would generously provide. Instead, I was carrying a carefully packed box of pottery in my trunk, along with business cards from 3 Asheville galleries that had expressed interest in displaying my work. More significantly, I was carrying a new understanding of my own capabilities, and an unshakable knowledge of who I was when I stopped trying to be who someone else needed me to be. The front door opened before I could reach for my keys, and Marcus appeared with arms outstretched, his expression arranged into the perfect combination of relief and concern. "Welcome home, sweetheart. I've missed you so much." His embrace felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous, and I caught the subtle tension in his shoulders that suggested he was as nervous about this reunion as I was. "I missed you too," I said, the lie coming easily now that I understood the game we were both playing. "How was Singapore?" "Productive but exhausting," he replied, taking my suitcase with attentive gallantry. "Tell me everything about your trip. Did the pottery thing help take your mind off the job situation?" The dismissive phrasing wasn't accidental. Marcus was already working to minimize my experience, to reduce 2 weeks of profound personal growth to a temporary distraction from more serious concern. I recognized the pattern now, the way he used subtle language choices to shape my understanding of what was important and what was merely indulgent. "It was exactly what I needed," I said carefully. "Very centering." We moved through the house as Marcus asked questions that seemed designed to gather intelligence, rather than express genuine interest. He wanted to know where I'd stayed, whom I'd met, what I'd learned, how much I'd spent. His queries felt like a debriefing rather than the eager curiosity of a loving spouse hearing about a partner's adventures. "I'm glad you got it out of your system," he said as we reached the kitchen. "Now we can focus on getting back to normal. I've been thinking about your job search strategy while I was away. I have some ideas about networking approaches that might be more effective than what you were doing before." The presumption that my creative exploration had been something to get out of my system rather than a meaningful step toward personal growth revealed everything about how Marcus viewed my autonomy. He saw my time in Asheville as a brief rebellion that was now finished, clearing the way for him to resume managing my choices and priorities. "Actually," I said, "I've been thinking about making some changes to my career direction." Marcus's smile faltered slightly. "What kind of change?" "I'm considering incorporating more creative work into my professional life, maybe doing some ceramics alongside UX design, or finding ways to combine both skills." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Marcus set down the glass of wine he'd been pouring with careful precision, his movements suddenly deliberate rather than natural. "Vera, we've talked about this. Pottery is a fine hobby, but it's not a realistic career path, especially not now, when we need steady income. People make good livings as ceramic artists," I said, keeping my voice level. "The instructor I worked with has supported herself through her pottery for over 15 years. In some artsy mountain town where the cost of living is probably half what it is here," Marcus countered. "This is Portland. We have a mortgage, car payments, responsibilities that require reliable income. You can't just abandon practical considerations because you had a nice vacation." The conversation was unfolding exactly as I'd expected, but hearing Marcus's arguments now felt different than it would have before my trip. His objections weren't based on careful analysis of my skills or market opportunities. they were rooted in his need to keep me financially dependent and emotionally constrained. A successful creative career would represent a form of independence that would interfere with his plans for our future, or rather his plans for his future, and my abandonment. I'm not talking about abandoning practical considerations. I'm talking about expanding them to include meaningful work and personal fulfillment. Marcus moved closer, reaching for my hands in a gesture that once would have felt romantic but now felt manipulative. I love your creativity, you know that, but timing matters. We need to stabilize our finances first, get you back into a well-paying tech position, and then maybe in a few years you could explore pottery as a side business. His timeline was carefully constructed to sound reasonable while ensuring that my creative aspirations would remain perpetually deferred. In a few years there would be new reasons why it wasn't the right time, new crises that required practical solutions rather than creative risk. He was offering me permission to dream as long as I never acted on those dreams. What if I said I wanted to start now? I asked, pulling my hands gently away from his. What if I said I'd rather take some financial risk to pursue work that feels meaningful? Something hard flashed across Marcus's features before he caught himself and restored his expression of patient concern. Then I'd say you're not thinking clearly about our situation. We're already behind on savings because of your job loss. This isn't the time for expensive experiments. The irony of his concern about our savings was staggering, given that he'd been systematically stealing those same savings to fund his escape with Rebecca. But I couldn't reveal my knowledge of his financial deception without exposing how I'd discovered it, so I had to navigate around the truth while testing his reactions. Maybe we should look at our finances together, I suggest. I'd like to understand exactly where we stand, so I can make informed decisions about my career. Marcus's hesitation was almost imperceptible, but I caught it. Of course, he said, though I should warn you, things are tighter than they were when you were employed. We've had to dip into savings more than I'd hoped. The understatement was breathtaking. He'd done more than dip into our savings. He'd systematically drained them while blaming fictional financial pressures created by my fabricated job loss. But his willingness to show me doctored statements meant he was confident in his ability to maintain the deception. I'd still like to see the numbers, I pressed. Understanding our real situation will help me make better decisions about what kind of work to pursue. Absolutely, Marcus agreed, though his enthusiasm seemed forced. I'll put together a summary for you tomorrow. Tonight, let's just enjoy being together again. I made dinner reservations at that Italian place you love. The restaurant he'd chosen was the same one where we'd celebrated our last anniversary, an elegant establishment in the Pearl District that specialized in the kind of sophisticated cuisine Marcus favored for important occasions. As we drove through the city, he maintained a steady stream of conversation about his trip to Singapore, describing business meetings and cultural observations, with the detailed enthusiasm he reserved for topics he wanted to control. I listened with half my attention while studying his profile in the glow of passing streetlights. This man had shared my bed for 8 years, had been present for countless intimate conversations and mundane daily interactions, yet I was only now seeing him clearly. The charm that had initially attracted me was revealed as a performance, the confidence I'd admired as arrogance, the protectiveness I'd appreciated as control. At the restaurant, Marcus ordered wine and appetizers with the authoritative flair he brought to most social situations, clearly intending to create an atmosphere of celebration and normalcy. But I found myself analyzing his behavior with the detached interest of an anthropologist, noting how he managed the evening to project an image of successful couplehood, while carefully steering conversation away from any topics that might challenge his preferred narrative. I have to say, he said as we waited for our entrees, you look different, relaxed. The trip was obviously good for you. I feel different, I admitted, which was true if incomplete. Good different, I hope. His smile was warm but his eyes were watchful. Clear different, I said. More connected to what I actually want rather than what I think I should want. Marcus raised his wine glass in a toast. To clarity, he said, and to moving forward together. The irony of his words was profound, given that his version of moving forward involved my abandonment and financial ruin, but I clinked my glass against his, and smiled as if I shared his optimism about our shared future. During dinner, I found myself studying other couples in the restaurant, wondering how many of them were also performing normalcy while hiding fundamental deception. The couple at the corner table seemed genuinely engaged with each other, leaning forward in animated conversation, while the pair near the window sat in the kind of comfortable silence that suggested deep familiarity and trust. Marcus and I realized, fell into neither category. We were maintaining the appearance of connection while carefully avoiding any real intimacy or honesty. The food was excellent, prepared with the kind of technical skill and artistic presentation that had once impressed me, but now seemed somehow sterile compared to the simple, honest meals I'd shared in Asheville. Everything about this evening felt curated rather than authentic, designed to create an impression rather than nourish genuine connection. As we walked back to the car, Marcus slipped his arm around my waist in a gesture that looked romantic to outside observers but felt possessive to me. "I'm so glad you're home," he murmured into my ear. "These 2 weeks reminded me how much I need you." The statement carried an undertone that might have been threatening if it hadn't been so obviously calculated. Marcus needed me, but only in specific ways and only as long as I remained manageable. The moment I became inconvenient or unpredictable, his need would transform into something much colder. Back at home, Marcus suggested we relax in the hot tub with another bottle of wine, creating the kind of romantic atmosphere he'd used throughout our marriage to smooth over conflicts and re-establish his preferred dynamic. But I begged off, claiming exhaustion from the long drive, and retreated to our bedroom while he remained downstairs, ostensibly checking emails, but probably coordinating whatever remained of his departure preparation. Alone in our master suite, I felt the full weight of the performance I would need to maintain until I was ready to reveal what I knew about his plans. The room that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a stage set, filled with props designed to support the illusion of a happy marriage. The photographs on the dresser showed a couple who looked convincingly in love, but I could see now how many of those smiles had been manufactured for the camera. I unpacked my suitcase methodically, hanging clothes that smelled faintly of mountain air in a closet filled with the carefully coordinated wardrobe I'd assembled for my role as Marcus's successful wife. The contrast was jarring, the simple, practical clothes I'd worn for pottery alongside the sophisticated outfits designed to project status and respectability. At the bottom of my suitcase, wrapped carefully in bubble wrap, was the small ceramic bowl I'd struggled with on my first day in Asheville. Enya had encouraged each student to keep one piece from our early efforts as a reminder of where we'd started and how far we'd traveled. The bowl was imperfect in every conventional sense, slightly lopsided, with fingerprint impressions still visible in the clay and glaze that had pooled unevenly around the rim. But it was honest in a way that nothing else in this bedroom was honest. A direct reflection of someone learning to trust process over outcome. I placed the bowl on my nightstand where it looked jarringly out of place among the sleek surfaces and coordinated accessories. Its rough authenticity highlighted the artificial perfection of everything around it, serving as a tangible reminder of who I was becoming versus who I'd been pretending to be. Marcus appeared in the doorway as I was closing the last dresser drawer, his expression curious as he noticed the ceramic piece. "Is that something you made?" "Yes," I said simply. He approached for a closer look, and I watched his face as he assessed my work. His smile was carefully neutral, the expression he used when he wanted to be diplomatically dismissive. "It's rustic," he said finally, "very handmade." The faint condescension in his tone was familiar, the same careful diminishment he'd applied to my creative efforts throughout our marriage. But hearing it now, after 2 weeks of being surrounded by people who understood that handmade was a virtue rather than a limitation, I felt something harden inside me. "That's the point," I said. "It's supposed to show the human touch." "Of course," Marcus agreed quickly, sensing that he'd misstepped. "I just meant, it's very different from the kind of polished work you see in stores. More personal." His attempt to recover revealed how little he understood about what I'd been learning in Asheville. The whole point of handmade ceramics was to celebrate rather than hide the evidence of human creation, to value authenticity over artificial perfection. His instinct to critique rather than appreciate showed me exactly how he viewed my creative development, as something to be managed rather than encouraged. As we prepared for bed, maintaining the familiar rhythms of our shared routine, I felt the strange dissonance of intimate domestic tasks performed by two people who were essentially strangers to each other. Marcus brushed his teeth with the same methodical precision he brought to everything, while I went through motions that felt increasingly performative. Lying in bed beside him, listening to his breathing settle into the regular pattern of sleep, I stared at the ceiling and planned my next move. I needed to gather more evidence of his financial deception, document the extent of his theft, and prepare for the confrontation that would inevitably come when he discovered I knew about his plan. But I also needed to protect myself, to ensure that when his carefully constructed deception finally collapsed, I would be positioned to survive and thrive, rather than simply react to his abandonment. The ceramic bowl caught moonlight from the bedroom window, its imperfect surface creating subtle patterns of light and shadow. In Asheville, I'd learned that the most beautiful effects often emerged from accepting rather than fighting the unpredictable elements of the creative process. Now I needed to apply that same principle to the dissolution of my marriage, trusting that honest confrontation with reality would ultimately create something more authentic and sustainable than the artificial perfection Marcus had been trying to maintain through deception. Tomorrow, I would begin the careful work of documenting his betrayal while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. I would play the role of the unknowing wife while gathering the evidence I needed to protect myself when his house of lies finally collapsed. The fire that would transform our relationship was inevitable now. I just needed to ensure that I was strong enough to survive it while he was consumed by the contradictions he'd been trying to manage. The woman lying in this bed tonight was not the same woman who'd fabricated a job loss 2 weeks earlier to test her husband's loyalty. That test had revealed far more than I'd bargained for, but it had also set in motion a process of transformation that couldn't be reversed. I'd been through my own fire in Asheville, and I'd emerged harder, clearer, and infinitely more honest about what I was willing to accept in my life. Marcus stirred in his sleep, reaching unconsciously for my hand in a gesture that had once felt loving but now felt like an attempt to maintain control, even in unconsciousness. I allowed the contact but felt nothing beyond mild curiosity about how much longer he planned to maintain this charade before disappearing with Rebecca and our stolen savings. The answer, I suspected, would come sooner than he expected. I was no longer the predictable, manageable wife he thought he'd left behind in Portland. I was someone who'd remembered how to create beauty from raw materials, how to trust process over outcome, how to build something authentic even when the foundation was uncertain. The reckoning was coming, and I was ready for it. The morning after my return, I woke to find Marcus already dressed for work, standing at the foot of our bed with his laptop open and a stack of papers in his hand. His expression carried the forced brightness he used when delivering news he expected me to resist. "I've been thinking about your situation," he announced, as if my career was a problem that required his management rather than my own decision-making. "I reached out to some contacts while you were away, and there's a UX position opening at Meridian Corp that would be perfect for you. The salary is actually higher than what you were making at Nexus." I sat up slowly, noting how he'd positioned himself to loom over me while I was still vulnerable in bed, a power dynamic he'd used throughout our marriage whenever he wanted to ensure compliance with his plan. "That was thoughtful of you," I said carefully, "but I haven't decided if I want to return to traditional UX work." Marcus's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Vera, be realistic. You can't support yourself making pottery. We need reliable income, especially now." He gestured with the papers, and I caught sight of what appeared to be financial statements, though from my angle I couldn't read the details. "What exactly is our financial situation?" I asked, pushing myself to sit up straight. "I'd like to see the actual numbers before making any career decisions." "Of course," Marcus said, but his hesitation was telling. "Though I should prepare you. Things are more challenging than I'd hoped. Between your job loss and some unexpected expenses while you were away, we've had to make some adjustments." The lie was delivered with such smooth confidence that I almost admired his skill, even as I felt disgust at his willingness to blame me for problems he'd created through systematic theft. He handed me the papers, and I forced myself to study them with the expression of confused concern he was expecting, rather than the analytical clarity I actually felt. The statements were masterfully falsified, showing a steady drain on our savings that corresponded exactly with the timeline of my supposed unemployment. Marcus had even created fictional entries for increased grocery costs and medical expenses, painting a picture of a household struggling to maintain its standard of living on a single income. The attention to detail was impressive and deeply disturbing. "This is worse than I realized," I said, playing my role perfectly. "I had no idea we were spending so much more than you were earning." Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, his posture radiating sympathetic concern. "I didn't want to worry you while you were dealing with the job loss, but now that you're back and feeling more centered, we need to face reality together." His use of the word centered wasn't accidental. He was acknowledging my trip to Asheville while simultaneously diminishing it to emotional therapy rather than meaningful personal development. In his narrative, I'd gone away confused and upset, but now I was ready to accept his guidance and return to my proper role in his carefully managed world. "The good news," he continued, "is that the Meridian position would solve our immediate problem. With your salary and my bonus coming up, we could be back on solid ground by the end of the year." I nodded as if considering his proposal seriously, while internally marveling at how completely he'd constructed this fictional crisis. According to his timeline, I would return to work, we would rebuild our savings, and our life would resume its previous pattern. Of course, by then he would be in Singapore with Rebecca, leaving me to discover the truth about our finances, when it was too late to recover our stolen assets. "I should probably apply soon then," I said, handing the papers back to him. "Though I'm curious about these medical expenses, I don't remember any major bills." Marcus barely glanced at the statements before folding them away. "Some dental work I had done while you were gone. Nothing serious, but the insurance didn't cover as much as expected." Another lie, delivered with the casual ease of someone who'd had weeks to prepare his explanation. I wondered how many other fabrications he'd constructed to account for the money he'd stolen, how elaborate his fictional version of our finances had become. "I'll call Meridian today," I said, giving him the compliance he was seeking. "Thank you for thinking of me while you were traveling." Marcus's relief was palpable, though he tried to hide it behind a mask of husbandly concern. He kissed my forehead with what might have seemed like affection to an outside observer, but felt like a pat of approval for a well-trained pet. "That's my girl. I knew you'd see reason once you had time to process everything." After he left for work, I sat alone in our kitchen, surrounded by the expensive appliances and designer finishes that had once represented success but now felt like props in an elaborate stage production. The granite countertops, the professional-grade coffee machine, the fresh flowers Marcus had arranged to welcome me home, all of it was designed to maintain an illusion of prosperity and stability while he systematically destroyed our actual financial foundation. I retrieved my laptop and spent the morning conducting my own investigation, using techniques I'd learned during my freelance design work to trace digital transactions and uncover hidden accounts. What I discovered was even worse than I'd initially realized. Marcus hadn't just been stealing our joint savings, he'd also been liquidating investments, borrowing against my retirement account, and even taking a second mortgage on our house. The scope of his financial deception was breathtaking in its audacity. He'd essentially been running a long-term con on his own wife, systematically converting every asset we'd built together into liquid funds he could transfer offshore. The fictional medical expenses and household costs he'd shown me that morning represented only a fraction of the money that had actually disappeared. More disturbing was the timeline I was able to reconstruct from email confirmations and bank records. Marcus had been planning this theft for at least 18 months, long before any problems in our marriage had become apparent to me. This wasn't a desperate response to marital unhappiness. It was a calculated campaign to strip me of financial independence while maintaining the appearance of being a devoted husband. I printed copies of everything I found, creating a comprehensive record of his deception that would be invaluable when I was ready to pursue legal action. But I also realized that I needed to move quickly. Based on the transfer schedules I'd uncovered, Marcus was planning to complete his theft within the next 2 weeks. Once that money reached its final destination, recovering it would become infinitely more complicated. The sound of my phone ringing interrupted my research, and I was surprised to see Anya's name on the caller ID. We'd exchanged contact information before I left Asheville, but I hadn't expected to hear from her so soon. "Vera," I hope you don't mind me calling, she said without preamble. I wanted to follow up on something we discussed before you left. Of course, I said, genuinely pleased to hear her voice. Is everything okay? More than okay. I had a conversation yesterday with a gallery owner in Portland who's been looking for ceramic artists with a background in design. When I described your work and your professional experience, she was very interested in meeting you. The unexpected opportunity hit me like a physical sensation, a rush of possibility that stood in stark contrast to the financial deception I'd been uncovering all morning. Really? Her name is Sophia Brennan, and she owns a gallery called Vessel in the Hawthorne district. She specializes in functional art, pottery, glasswork, textiles, and she's been wanting to expand her ceramic offering. Your combination of artistic skill and professional design experience is exactly what she's looking for. I wrote down Sophia's contact information, my hands trembling slightly as I processed what this might mean. Here was a concrete opportunity to build the kind of creative career I'd been dreaming about, completely independent of Marcus's plans for my professional future. There's something else, Anya continued. Sophia mentioned that she's looking for someone who could teach workshops at the gallery, beginning pottery classes, maybe some design integration courses. It would be part-time initially, but she said the right person could develop it into something substantial. The possibility of teaching, of sharing what I'd learned about the transformative power of working with clay, felt like the universe offering me exactly what I needed at the moment I most needed it. But it also represented a direct challenge to everything Marcus had been trying to convince me was realistic and responsible. I don't know if I'm ready for something like that, I said, though even as I spoke the words I knew they weren't true. Vera, Anya said gently, the clay doesn't ask if you're ready, it only asks if you're willing. After ending the call, I sat in silence for several minutes, feeling the weight of the choice that was crystallizing before me. I could call Sophia Brennan and begin building the kind of life I'd discovered I wanted during my time in Asheville, or I could call Meridian Corp and accept the UX position Marcus had arranged, returning to the safe, predictable path that would keep me financially dependent and emotionally constrained. The decision should have been difficult, but sitting in our expensive kitchen, surrounded by evidence of Marcus's systematic betrayal, I realized it was actually simple. I'd already been fired from my old life the moment I overheard that phone conversation about Cayman accounts and Singapore plans. Everything since then had been an extended process of deciding what to build from the ruins. I called Sophia Brennan and scheduled a meeting for that afternoon. The Vessel Gallery was everything I'd hoped it would be, a light-filled space in a converted warehouse, where functional art was displayed, not as precious objects but as items meant to be touched, used and integrated into daily life. Sophia herself was a woman in her 50s with clay-stained fingernails, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she saw through pretense to essential character. Anya showed me photos of your work, she said as we walked through the gallery space. Your technical skills are solid, but what impressed me most was the honesty in your pieces. They don't try to be anything other than what they are. She led me to a back room where pottery classes were held, with wheels arranged in a circle and shelves lined with works in progress. I've been thinking about expanding our educational offerings, maybe developing some courses that combine traditional pottery techniques with contemporary design principles. Anya thought you might be interested in developing something like that. As Sophia described her vision for the program, I felt the same sense of rightness I'd experienced during my first day in Anya's studio. This wasn't just a job opportunity, it was a chance to build something meaningful, to create a community around the transformative power of making art with your hands. I'd love to try, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. Good, Sophia said with a smile. Let's start with a trial class next weekend. If it goes well, we can talk about a more formal arrangement. Driving home through late afternoon traffic, I felt a sense of momentum I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since discovering Marcus's betrayal, I was moving toward something positive, rather than simply reacting to his deception. I had a plan that belonged entirely to me, a vision for my future that had nothing to do with his manipulation or control. Marcus was already home when I arrived, standing in the kitchen with his phone pressed to his ear, and an expression of barely controlled agitation. He ended the call abruptly when he saw me, but not before I caught fragments of conversation that sounded more urgent than his usual business discussions. "How did the job interview go?" he asked, his smile not quite reaching his eye. "I haven't called them yet," I said, setting down my purse with deliberate casualness. "I had some other things to take care of today." Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What kind of other things?" "Just errands, catching up on things that accumulated while I was away." I moved to the refrigerator, using the mundane task of checking our dinner options to avoid direct eye contact while I delivered the next part of my performance. Though I did get an interesting call from my pottery instructor, there might be some teaching opportunities in Portland. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. When I finally turned around, Marcus was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between frustration and genuine anger, quickly masked but unmistakable. "Teaching pottery." His tone carried the same careful dismissal he'd used throughout our marriage, but now I could hear the calculation beneath it. "Vera, we've talked about this. That's not going to pay our bills." "It might not pay all of them," I agreed, "but it could be a way to transition into the kind of work I actually want to do." Marcus moved closer, and I recognized the body language he used when he was trying to regain control of a situation that had started to slip away from him. "Sweetheart, I understand the appeal of following your dreams, but timing matters. We're in a precarious financial position right now. This isn't the moment for experiment." His use of the word experiments was particularly galling, given that his own experiment in systematic theft had been progressing quite successfully for months. But I maintained my expression of thoughtful consideration, playing the role of the wife who was genuinely weighing her husband's practical concerns against her impractical desires. "What if I did both?" I suggested. "Took the meridian position but also pursued the teaching opportunity on weekends." Marcus's relief was visible, though he tried to disguise it as approval of my compromise. "That sounds much more reasonable, building something slowly while maintaining financial stability." Of course, his definition of financial stability was based on the fiction that we still had assets to protect, rather than the reality that he'd already stolen everything and was simply maintaining appearances until his final departure. But I nodded as if his guidance was helpful rather than hypocritical. That evening, as we went through the motions of our normal routine, I felt the strange dissonance of intimate domestic life conducted by two people who were essentially actors in each other's deception. Marcus was performing the role of supportive husband while planning my abandonment. I was performing the role of trusting wife while documenting his betrayal. The difference was that my performance had an endpoint. Soon I would stop pretending and confront him with everything I knew. His performance, by contrast, was designed to continue indefinitely, or at least until the moment he disappeared with Rebecca and our stolen savings. 3 days later, as I was preparing for my trial class at Vessel Gallery, Marcus made an announcement that clarified his timeline. "I just got word about another Singapore trip," he said over breakfast, his tone carefully casual. "Apparently the client wants to accelerate the project timeline. I'll need to leave again next week." The timing wasn't coincidental. Based on my research into our financial accounts, next week would mark the completion of his asset transfer. His second business trip would actually be his permanent departure, timed to occur while I was supposedly focused on my new teaching responsibilities, rather than monitoring our household finances. "How long this time?" I asked, matching his casual tone. "Hard to say. Could be 2 weeks, could be longer. Depends on how the negotiations go." I nodded sympathetically, playing the role of the understanding wife who accepted that business travel was an unfortunate necessity. "I'll miss you, but at least I'll have the pottery classes to keep me busy." Marcus's smile was warm and seemingly genuine, the expression of a man who believed his careful planning was proceeding exactly as intended. He had no idea that his wife had spent the week consulting with divorce attorneys, documenting his financial crimes, and preparing to file legal actions that would freeze his offshore accounts before he could complete his theft. The trial pottery class that weekend exceeded my most optimistic expectations. 8 students showed up, ranging from complete beginners to people who'd taken occasional workshops, but wanted more structured instruction. As I guided them through their first attempts at centering clay, I felt the same sense of purpose and connection I'd discovered in Asheville. "The most important thing to understand about clay," I told the class as they struggled with their first attempts, is that it responds to your emotional state as much as your physical technique. If you're tense or trying to force a result, the clay will fight you. If you're present and patient, it will work with you to create something beautiful. One student, a woman named Janet, who'd mentioned going through a difficult divorce, looked up from her wobbling bowl with tears in her eyes. It's like therapy, she said quietly. It is therapy, I agree. Clay doesn't lie or pretend, or try to be anything other than what it is. Working with it teaches you to value the same honesty in yourself. After the class ended, and I'd helped students clean up their workstations, Sophia approached me with an expression of satisfaction. That was exactly what I was hoping for, she said. You weren't just teaching technique, you were teaching transformation. Would you be interested in developing this into a regular program? Standing in that sun-filled studio, surrounded by the evidence of creative growth and authentic connection, I felt a clarity I'd never experienced before. This was who I was meant to be, not Marcus's carefully managed wife, not a corporate UX designer fulfilling someone else's vision, but a teacher and artist who helped people discover their own creative power. Yes, I said without hesitation, I'd love to build something here. That evening, as Marcus packed for what he believed would be his final trip, I watched him with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a fascinating but ultimately alien culture. His movements were efficient and practiced, each item placed in his suitcase with the care of someone who would never be returning to retrieve anything he'd left behind. I'll call you when I land, he said, kissing me goodbye with the same performed affection he'd maintained throughout our marriage. Have a safe trip, I replied, meaning it in ways he couldn't possibly understand. After his car disappeared down our street, I opened my laptop and began executing the plan I'd spent days preparing. Within an hour I'd filed for divorce, requested emergency freezing of all joint accounts, and submitted a detailed report of financial fraud to both local authorities and the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. By morning, Marcus would discover that his carefully constructed deception had collapsed while he was 30,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. The accounts he'd planned to drain would be frozen, his assets would be under investigation, and his wife would no longer be available to manipulate or control. I spent that first night alone in our house, not sleeping but planning. I would sell the house, and use my share of the proceeds to fund a pottery studio of my own. I would develop the teaching program at Vessel Gallery, while building my own artistic practice. I would create a life based on authenticity rather than appearance, substance rather than status. The ceramic bowl from my first day in Asheville sat on my nightstand, its imperfect surface catching moonlight from the bedroom window. It had been shaped by inexperienced hands, fired in conditions that couldn't be completely controlled, and emerged from the kiln bearing the honest marks of its creation process. Just like me, Marcus had tested my dependence by saying he'd been fired, planning to use my vulnerability to cover his own crimes. Instead, he'd given me the perfect opportunity to discover who I really was when I stopped trying to be who someone else needed me to be. The fire had done its work. I was ready for whatever came next. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.